with the Gospel of Mark. Last week, I think we made one quick point about the Gospel of Mark, and that is it's the shortest of the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the shortest of them, and over 90% of the material in Mark ends up being in one of the other two, in Matthew or in Luke. Secondly, we mentioned the style of Mark. Mark is more inclined to tell us what Jesus did versus what He said. More inclined to tell us what He did and instead of what He said. Now, Mark's portrayal of Jesus also speaks a lot about extremes and a lot about the dramatic incidences. For example, he talks about Jesus' popular acclaim along with the opposition and the struggle. He talks about power and authority up against fatigue and sorrow. So everything has a tendency in Mark to be presented along with extremes. So keep that in mind as far as Mark is concerned. More clearly than any of the other Gospels, Mark definitely talks about all of the abuses of the Jews, which is kind of an odd thing because usually you would think that would come where? Who do you think would mostly deal more with the problems that Jesus had with the Jews? You would think Matthew, but it's actually not. It actually is Mark. He talks about the practices like the Sabbath day, the ceremonial laws about eating, the use of the temple, and those conflicts are in Mark. And Mark presents them to this Roman audience. Mark uses language that the other writers don't. 5 times he uses Aramaic language, but then he translates it. Mark uses Latin equivalents for terms and for amounts, kind of indicating this is the audience that it's written for. Also, he speaks about the fact that Mark's style, when you have like ancient traditions, he tends to kind of put them that are more action-oriented instead of more tradition or law-oriented, which is going to play more to the audience of the Romans who appreciate Jesus being a man of action instead of being a man of instruction. That doesn't mean that there's no instruction in Mark. It's just nowhere near as heavy as the instruction that's in, say, a Matthew. There's no opening genealogy. Why? Wouldn't have meant anything. It wouldn't have meant anything. There's not really a mention of a whole lot of fulfilled prophecy. Why not? But, right, again, because that just wouldn't have really rung a bell with them, I guess you could say. But also, right away when Mark opens, you're right at the Jordan River. With who? Just right with John the Baptist, right at the Jordan River. In fact, Mark reaches in chapter 1 what Matthew takes 8 chapters to get. Mark in chapter 1 is already where it takes Matthew 8 chapters to get. Mark covers in 9 chapters what Matthew takes in twice as many to take. And you would be naturally inclined to think that in order to do that, you've got to cut out all of the detail. But that's not the way it is. Mark actually has details in it that none of the other Gospels have. Some of the examples that are in your notes, he gives graphic perspective. He emphasizes by a repetition. He also talks about details like name and time and number and location that the other Gospel writers don't. In fact, almost all of the Lord's looks and gestures and emotional reactions are recorded by Mark. So again, you've got this idea that because it's such a short gospel that it must really skimp on the detail, but it doesn't, because it takes away all of those longer teaching discourses. Then it gives Mark room to instill all of this detail. And again, all of that detail is what's going to be more applicable to the Romans. Okay? So now we get to Luke. And who was Luke addressed to? Who was Luke addressed to? Luke was addressed to the Greeks. So let's make some comments about this. His is the highest literary quality of any of the records of the ministry of Jesus. The Gospel of Luke is the longest book of the New Testament, and of course, together with Acts, it makes about a quarter of the content of the New Testament. So the New Testament's got 27 books. 2 of them have about a quarter of the material that are in it. Now, what was Luke revealing? We'll get to that next week, but in Luke chapter 1, in that prologue, what was Luke's stated purpose? What did he want to do? What does Luke say he wants to do? He wants to give an accurate chronological account of the life of Jesus Christ. Some argue that Luke's is the most chronological. So in everything that plays out in the Gospels, Luke's is the most accurate. And that's probably the case. There's some doubt about that, but Luke's probably is the case with that. Luke introduces a lot of different details. I mentioned last time the Galilean work that Matthew spends a lot of time on. Luke hardly even mentions it. But in the trip from Galilee down to Judea, Luke has all kinds of detail. In fact, a fantastic part of Luke's gospel deals with that trip, that last trip south. So once he reaches Judea there at the end, it's no time until he's arrested and tried and crucified. But on that trip down, Luke just has incredible amounts of detail. How does Luke get his material? From the prologue from next week, how does Luke get his material? Eyewitnesses. So Matthew, you have these groupings, and the groupings are so systematic, it seems like it has to be something very intentional. In Mark, you have this very rapid, fast-moving pacing, but in Luke, you have a story that literally is told. So when you go back to the old expression, what is the gospel? The greatest story ever told. Luke is the gospel that best fulfills that specific statement. And again, we'll see what all happens with it. It constituted the result of the work of other people. It was eyewitnesses. He arranged the information to Theophilus. And we'll speak about who Theophilus is as we get to next week. Now, it begins with the narrative of Jesus' birth, which doesn't seem to be unique, because who else has a narrative of Jesus' birth? Matthew does. However, Luke's gospel has a longer account of it. It has details that Matthew doesn't give. The same is true about the account of the resurrection appearances. Luke has detail that the other Gospels don't. What's one big notable detail that Luke talks about in the resurrection appearances that the other three don't mention? There's one particular one. The discussion to the disciples on the road to Emmaus. Only Luke records that. And again, it gives us so much more information. Luke makes it more important to talk about teachings. He deals with teachings quite a bit. Also, Luke, when you think about what Luke does, being a cultured Greek, addresses Gentiles of social rank, proclaims Jesus as weaving together this material that gives an image of personality. So, whereas Mark is a man of action, Luke is more a man of personality. He presents the personality of Jesus Christ. And what personality is that going to be? Do you think? Again, Matthew does such a good job in presenting Jesus as what? As a Messiah, exactly. As a rightful king, as someone who is fulfilling Old Testament prophecy. Mark, Jesus is a man of action. Remember the terminology that we mentioned with Mark. So many times when Jesus works a miracle, it was what? Straight away. And immediately it took place. Now we get to Luke. And what's kind of Luke's claim to fame? He's a man of compassion. Yes, a man of compassion. So Luke is someone who is a lot more given to the idea of humanitarian concerns. And you can see this in the encounter with Zacchaeus, with Mary and Martha, with the healing of the woman with an infirmity, with the Good Samaritan, the prodigal son, the rich man and Lazarus, the Pharisee and the publican are all examples of that. What does it produce? What does it present? What is the personality of Jesus? Well, you see that more than you do in the other two. And then more than any New Testament writer, Luke shows the interest of Jesus in all people, not just who? Not just the Jews. Not just the Jews. Now, again, why did we say that this was the case? Why is Luke presenting Jesus as a man of compassion? Let's go back there. Once you learn this and you memorize this, it really does help to kind of open up the Gospels to you. Yes. To the Greco-Roman world, their gods were not good people, not good individuals. They could act on a whim, they could destroy people on a whim, but what was Jesus? He was compassionate, yes. Luke is basically broken down into 4 sections. The first section is the Lord's nativity narrative. The second section is His work in Galilee. That one's a lot shorter, again, than Matthew and Mark. The third section is that long chronicle of that journey from Galilee down to Judea. And then the fourth and final section is the final week and weeks, final week of Jesus' life, and then afterwards in the resurrection appearances. So some of the ways that you can tell Luke was written to Gentiles, just some things to mention. Luke frequently mentions Jewish localities. You wouldn't have to do that if your audience were Jews. He had to trace Jesus' genealogy, but who does he go back to? He goes back to Adam. And there's a big difference in the number of individuals in Matthew's genealogy and the number of individuals in Jesus' genealogy. And again, in reconciling those two of them, that's not the easiest thing in the world to do. But going back to Adam shows that Jesus is the representative of who? All of mankind. Also as well, Luke refers to Roman emperors in not only designating when Jesus was born, but also when John the Baptist kind of began, and then along with that, Jesus began too. Luke uses a lot of words that would be more familiar to Gentile readers, as opposed to, say, Matthew's Gospel. He also uses words, I didn't put this in the notes, but Luke also uses a lot of words that are intrinsically found in discussions among the medical field. Why is that? Because he was the beloved physician. Luke uses the Septuagint. When you quote from the Old Testament, he uses relatively few direct quotes, but the book is filled with allusions. What's the difference between a direct quote and an allusion? We'll have to get to this eventually, because in about in Matthew chapter 2, we're going to have to deal with the distinction between these. Some would say that it's a contradiction. There are lots of people who would say, I mean, I've read online just within the last few weeks that why on earth would you believe in the Gospels? Because they're just hopelessly crammed full of all different kinds of contradictions. And one of the contradictions that we'll come to pretty quickly in Matthew chapter 2 is supposedly this contradiction between the Old Testament quotation and an allusion. So what's the difference between the two of them? So a quotation would literally be what? It would come out, and it may not be word for word, but it's really, really close. And it's attributed to that actual writer. An allusion would simply be a referencing back to something in the Old Testament. It might be word for word, or it may not. It may mention the writer, or it may not. It may blend, and this is what happens in Matthew chapter 2, it may blend two or three ideas together, but it leaves you with the impression that it all comes from this specific author. But it doesn't. It's just the way that Matthew was quoting it. So these ideas become, again, a lot of times people could say something or attack the Gospels, but we'll handle all of that. Very little is said about Jesus fulfilling prophecy. Why? It just wasn't that important to Luke's readers. You think that's kind of amazing, but I mean, the Holy Spirit inspired Luke to write it, so the Holy Spirit knew what he was doing. And sure enough, they were much more involved with the idea of Jesus being a real, actual person who was on the earth, compared to a mythical being who was somewhere else. Okay? That was really applicable to them. Okay, so let's talk for a few minutes about what a lot of people call the synoptic problem. And the only reason that I bring this up to you is that two reasons. First of all, a lot of people have study Bibles now. And a lot of people study Bibles. So study Bibles over time are getting better and better and better. And some of them really, really dive deep into the weeds in as far as the introduction to these Gospels. And so I needed to bring up three ideas behind the synoptic problem. So in expressing a synoptic problem, what do you think that problem might be? Okay, so for one thing, all three of them don't say the same thing. On the other hand, they all sound really what? They all sound really what? Really close. And I put this actually at the end of the notes, so I'll say it now in case I forget it. It is so funny to look at biblical scholarship, because really hardcore, intensive criticism about the Gospels started somewhere in the mid-1800s. And in 1850, they were just dead set in showing that the Gospels had so many differences that you couldn't possibly trust them. Just absolutely full of contradictions. And honestly, in the last 170 years, that idea has really stayed around. But now scholarship has swung all the way to the other side of the pendulum. So in the last 50 to 75 years, now the Gospels are what? They're too much alike. In fact, they're so alike, we've got to figure out why they're so alike. Hence the three different types of criticism that I'm going to talk to you about. So the first one is source criticism. And source criticism is the earliest criticism that came along. And it just basically is like what it sounds. So we've got to determine what about the Gospels? Where they came from, what the sources are. Well, I thought the source was who? God. Well, not so fast. Because there are lots of people who believe that Matthew and Luke took from Mark. So the idea would be that Mark is the earliest gospel because 90% of Mark is replicated in the other two. So number one, Mark comes first, which I disagree with. We'll get to that. So Mark comes first to be the source material for Matthew and Luke. And then along with Matthew and Luke, there's these other sayings that Matthew and Luke have that Mark doesn't have. And these sayings are assigned to something called Q or Quelle, which is German for source. So one of these first premier places to be so critical of the gospel actually came from Germany, and that's why you have Quelle or source or Q. And it is very, very realistic if you've got a study Bible to be looking through that study Bible in the Gospels and it mentioned the fact of this mysterious Q, either in an introduction or in maybe one of the sayings of Jesus. So the idea is, and this is only basically the two-source model, which is Mark and this Q. It gets all the way up to a four-source model, which essentially says that with Matthew, who was an eyewitness, that's apparently not good enough. So Matthew has to use Mark, who wasn't what? Who wasn't an eyewitness, like an apostle. So Matthew, who was there, has to use Mark, who wasn't there, and this other source to be able to write his gospel. That just doesn't what? That just doesn't, it doesn't wash. It doesn't make sense. For Luke, Luke specifically says, which we'll see next week, Luke specifically says, I did what? I went to eyewitnesses. So apparently those eyewitnesses weren't good enough. He's got to what? He's got to bring in these mysterious sources. So it just doesn't really fully wash with the fact that the Holy Spirit could have easily what? Given Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John every bit of the information that they need. The second type of criticism is called form criticism. So what form criticism tries to do is to delineate into the Gospels different formats that came along. And the idea of writing all of these different formats is that the Gospels don't flow like a biography that one would expect. So they group them into these different pieces. And there's a lot of them. I have a chart that I didn't want to get that deep into it. But there's a chart that shows 6 or 7 different forms of the Gospels. I gave you a few of them in your notes. Legends, tales, myths, and parables. So form criticism kind of operates on the principle that the Gospels are constructed with these different forms. And then each writer just pulled the form that he wanted and that he needed from that point. And then that gives us the the units then to put together that makes the gospel tell its story. Which again is a long, long way around a simple fact. The Holy Spirit could have just what? Could have just revealed it that way. And so you don't have a myth or a fable or a legend. You just have what? You just have the account that the Holy Spirit revealed to Mark, or you have the account as Luke learns from eyewitnesses. The Holy Spirit then gives him the capability to write that information in this coherent, cogent gospel. You know, again, essentially what they're trying to do, and this began because it began back in the 1800s. You know, we live in postmodernism. What was in the 1800s? Modernism. And what did modernism famously do? It tried to explain away the supernatural element of the working of God. And that went all the way up the ladder. I mean, it went all the way through to creation. So in the mid-1800s, what idea did you have that came along the kind of the path with modernism that tried to bridge the gap between theism and evolution? You had what? Theistic evolution. God created the world, the universe 15 billion years ago, and then just let it what? Evolve. Just let it develop as it goes. So that kind of bridges the gap. That's the way that you explain the miraculous. Wayne, I used to love talking to Wayne about this, and he brought it up so many times. He would watch these specials on different Bible miracles, and what did the specials do? They basically try to explain away the miraculous. So one of them was that he had watched and told me about one time, were that the Israelites crossed the Red Sea, and the experts said, how'd they cross the Red Sea? They crossed at a part where guess what they could do? They just wade across it. So is the Bible correct? Sort of. They did cross the Red Sea, but they were able to do it on dry ground because it really wasn't that miraculous of it. So there you've got that blending together. And that's what these forms of criticism are trying to do. They're trying to blend together to get the product, but to kind of pull that supernatural element away from it. The last one is redaction criticism. And redaction criticism more treats the writers like editors. So when they saw something that seems to need a little bit of polishing, then they would go in and enhance it instead of actually writing the words that were coming from God. And there's two places in the Gospels that are very, very famous for this. We'll talk about both of them when we get there. One of them will be a long way off. But one of them is John chapter 8. If you guys go to John chapter 8, there's going to be somebody in the room where when you got John chapter 8 verses 1 through 11, you'll have a note down in your study Bible that will tell you what? That it wasn't included. So John chapter 8, 1 through 11, kind of becomes this editorial work that bridges the gap between the end of chapter 7 into Jesus' discussion of being the what? In John chapter 8, verse 12, famously, I am the light of the world. So it explains that. The other big one is the end of Mark. So Mark chapter 16 in some manuscripts ends with verse 7. And that's very, very abrupt. If you go back and look at Mark chapter 16, verse 7, that's a very abrupt ending. So there are people who would believe that 8 through 20 was an editorial work. So someone inserted that. That's redaction criticism. So it goes through and it looks at all of these little places and comments where it thinks that's not how it had to have originally have been. Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John actually had to have worked on that to make it smoother. Instead of just simply believing something that to me is much more obvious, and again, that is what? That the Holy Spirit could have just simply given them this material. So for literally, guys, for 150 years, people have expended a lot of effort among these three Gospels to really just come back to they missed a very simple point. The Holy Spirit could have just simply inspired all of this. Okay, so let's talk about the Gospel of John now. So the Gospel of John, well, that's 11. So what we'll do is we'll take up the Gospel of John next time. We'll finish with the Gospel of John. We'll talk about authorship and date quickly, and then get ready for Luke chapter 1. If you would like that material, it's up here on the front pew.